Within hours of a high stakes regional summit wrapping in Cairo, Egyptian officials made contact with Iranian counterparts, not to coordinate talking points, not to schedule future meetings, but to signal what analysts are calling the most significant diplomatic realignment in the Middle East in 40 years. Professor Mohammad Marandi, senior advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team, didn't just confirm the shift. He provided the timeline. And the timeline changes everything about American influence in the region. Your gas prices, your grocery costs, your 401k exposure to energy markets, all of it just shifted because Egypt, the second largest recipient of American military aid on planet Earth, just made a calculation that Washington is no longer the only power worth aligning with. What happens when a country that's taken $80 billion in U.S. assistance since 1978 decides the better deal is elsewhere? This channel operates on zero corporate funding, no government backing, and no pressure from advertisers telling us what angles to avoid. If you want geopolitical analysis that tracks power shifts before mainstream outlets even notice them, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear didn't make the evening news. It won't, but it rewrites the board. Let me show you exactly what happened in that 27-hour window between summit conclusion and Egyptian outreach to Tehran. The summit itself was standard choreography. Arab League foreign ministers, African Union representatives, Egyptian President Sisi hosting in Cairo. Official agenda: Gaza ceasefire framework, humanitarian corridor negotiations, post-conflict reconstruction planning. The kind of gathering that produces joint communiques full of carefully negotiated language that commits no one to anything specific. Sisi opened with the expected remarks: commitment to Palestinian statehood, concern over civilian casualties, call for all parties to de-escalate. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken attended via secure video link, reportedly pressing Egypt to maintain its role as intermediary between Israel and Hamas while keeping the Rafah crossing operational under terms acceptable to Tel Aviv. The summit concluded at 11 p.m. Cairo time on a Tuesday. Standard diplomatic protocol would involve a 48 to 72-hour period of internal assessment before any participant takes unilateral action based on discussions. That's how this process normally works. You talk, you return home, you consult, you decide, you act. Egypt skipped every intermediate step. By 6 p.m. Cairo time the following day, 19 hours after summit conclusion, Egyptian intelligence officials were in communication with Iranian counterparts. Not through Swiss intermediaries, which is how Washington and Tehran often communicate. Not through Omani back channels, which is how regional messages typically get passed when direct contact is diplomatically awkward. Direct contact. Egyptian General Intelligence Directorate to Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security. Professor Marandi's statement wasn't vague. The Egyptians reached out within a day of their summit, not to clarify positions, to explore alignment. When a senior advisor to Iran's negotiating team uses the word alignment, he's not describing a phone call to compare notes. He's describing the opening of a channel that didn't exist 72 hours earlier. Now here's what the official State Department readout said about the summit. Quote, productive discussions on humanitarian access and the path towards sustainable peace. That's the entirety of the U.S. government's public characterization. Productive discussions. No mention of Egyptian follow-up. No acknowledgement of any shift in Egypt's posture. No indication that Washington even registered what happened in the 19 hours after Blinken logged off that video call. But the operational reality tells a different story. Within 72 hours of that initial Egyptian outreach, 3 things happened that don't make sense unless you understand that Cairo just changed its risk assessment about who holds leverage in the region. First, Egyptian media, state-controlled outlets that don't publish anything without approval, began running stories questioning the effectiveness of U.S.-led ceasefire proposals, not framing them as inadequate, framing them as structurally incapable of addressing Egyptian security concerns. The shift in language is technical but significant, and inadequate implies the U.S. approach needs adjustment. Structurally incapable implies the entire framework is built on assumptions Egypt no longer shares. Second, Egyptian military officials postponed a scheduled joint exercise with U.S. Central Command. The exercise, Bright Star 2024, has run biennially since 1981. It's the oldest and largest combined military exercise in the Middle East. Postponement was attributed to logistical constraints. Logistical constraints is diplomatic language for, we're reassessing whether this serves our interests. Third, and this is where it gets specific, Egyptian officials quietly informed the IMF that Cairo would be exploring alternative financing arrangements for its $8 billion extended fund facility. The IMF loan, agreed in March, came with conditions tied to U.S. preferences on currency flexibility and subsidy reform. Egypt signaling openness to alternative arrangements is Egypt saying it might not need Washington's blessing to access capital. And there's only one region willing to provide multi-billion-dollar financing without demanding economic restructuring that benefits American investors. That region speaks Mandarin and Farsi. Here's the technical dimension that explains why this isn't just diplomatic posturing. Egypt controls the Suez Canal. 12% of global trade by volume passes through that waterway. 30% of global container traffic. Roughly 1 million barrels of oil per day. The canal generated $10 billion in revenue for Egypt in 2023. It is the single most important choke point for Europe-Asia trade outside the Strait of Malacca. If Egypt decides that its alignment with Washington creates more risk than benefit, that canal becomes a venue for leverage. Not closure, that would be economically suicidal for Cairo, but operational preference. Which flagged vessels get priority passage? Which cargo gets expedited? Which nations get charged the standard rate versus the rate that includes security surcharges and administrative fees? China has been courting Egypt for exactly this reason for 15 years. Belt and Road Initiative funding built Cairo's new administrative capital. Chinese firms operate the expanded canal infrastructure. Beijing doesn't need to own the canal. It needs Cairo to remember who financed the upgrades when decisions about access get made. Now let me show you the math that explains why Egypt is making this calculation right now. US military aid to Egypt, $1, $3 billion annually. Sounds significant until you realize that figure hasn't increased since 1987. Adjusted for inflation, $1, $3 billion in 1987 dollars equals roughly $3, $5 billion today. Meaning in real terms, American military assistance to Egypt has decreased by 63% over 4 decades, while Washington's demands on how Egypt uses that aid have increased significantly. Contrast that with Chinese investment in Egypt over the past 10 years, $28 billion. Not aid, investment. Infrastructure projects that employ Egyptian labor, generate Egyptian revenue, and don't come with requirements that Egypt restructure its domestic politics to satisfy Western human rights organizations. Add Iranian trade potential. Egypt currently imports 60% of its wheat. Russia and Ukraine were primary suppliers. That supply chain is unreliable for reasons everyone understands. Iran produces a wheat surplus and needs hard currency. Egypt needs stable grain imports and wants to reduce dependence on suppliers whose production is subject to conflict disruption. Tehran and Cairo have mutual economic interest in a direct grain trade arrangement. The only thing preventing it until now was Egyptian concern that Washington would view such a deal as unacceptable geopolitical realignment. The calculation Egypt is making, $1, $3 billion in U.S. military aid that comes with oversight, conditions, and political strings versus $28 billion in Chinese infrastructure investment plus potential Iranian trade relationships that come with no demands about how Cairo governs internally. The math isn't close. But there's a second layer to this math that makes the Egyptian decision even more rational. Gaza. Egypt shares a border with Gaza. The Rafah crossing is Egyptian territory. For 20 months, Egypt has been pressured by Washington to keep that crossing open under security arrangements that satisfy Israeli requirements. Those requirements include Egyptian acceptance of Israeli military presence in the Philadelphia corridor, a buffer zone on the Egyptian side of the border that Israel insists on controlling to prevent weapon smuggling. Egyptian sovereignty says no foreign military operates on Egyptian soil. Israeli security doctrine says we control the buffer or weapons flow to Hamas. Washington's position for 2 years has been, Egypt, figure out how to give Israel what it needs without calling it what it is. Cairo has been caught between maintaining sovereignty and satisfying its largest military patron. Now imagine your Egyptian military leadership. You've spent 2 years navigating an impossible contradiction. Then you watch Washington provide $14 billion in supplemental military aid to Israel while holding your $1. $3 billion to the same inflation-eroded baseline it's been at since 1987. You watch American diplomatic effort focus entirely on ensuring Israeli security requirements are met, while your concerns about refugee flows, economic stability, and domestic political pressure get framed as secondary considerations. And then Iran, which has spent 4 decades as a regional adversary, sends a message through back channels. We have no interest in destabilizing Egypt. We have significant interest in reducing American freedom of action in the region. If your assessment is that Washington treats you as a logistics problem, rather than a strategic partner, we're willing to discuss what a different arrangement looks like. The only surprise is that Egypt waited this long. Now let me show you what happens on the geopolitical chessboard when the second largest Arab state starts exploring alignment with Iran. China is watching this with the attention of a power that has spent 20 years building exactly this outcome. Beijing's entire Middle East strategy is premised on the idea that American security guarantees are deteriorating assets. Washington can't sustain military presence in the Gulf, maintain confrontation with Iran, support Israel unconditionally, and expect Arab states to absorb the costs of all three simultaneously. Something has to give. China has been positioning itself as the viable alternative when that breaking point arrives. Egyptian realignment accelerates every calculation Beijing is making about the Gulf. If Cairo, traditional anchor of the moderate Arab coalition, peace treaty signatory with Israel, recipient of massive U.S. aid, if Cairo is reassessing, then every other regional actor is watching to see if Egypt gets punished or rewarded for hedging. If Egypt hedges and prospers, the message to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and others is clear. American patronage is no longer the only path to security and economic development. China doesn't need Egypt to join an anti-American bloc. China needs Egypt to demonstrate that non-alignment is viable. That's a much lower bar and infinitely more dangerous to U.S. interests. Russia benefits passively. Moscow's strategy in the Middle East is elegant in its simplicity. Create conditions where American attention and resources are consumed by unsolvable regional conflicts. Egypt pivoting toward Iran doesn't require Russian action. It doesn't cost Moscow a dollar. But it creates one more variable Washington has to manage, one more relationship that requires diplomatic bandwidth, one more example of U.S. influence encountering limits. Every hour of American strategic attention devoted to stabilizing the Egypt-Israel relationship, to preventing Egyptian-Iranian coordination, to maintaining the current regional architecture, is an hour not spent on Ukraine, Taiwan, or any other theater where Russian and American interests collide directly. Moscow's gains are measured in American distraction and exhaustion. And then there's Iran. For Tehran, this is confirmation of a thesis they've held since 2003. American power in the Middle East rests on a foundation of client relationships that only hold as long as those clients believe Washington can deliver security and prosperity better than any alternative. The moment that belief weakens, the entire structure becomes negotiable. Iran didn't force Egypt to make this move. Tehran simply continued existing as a powerful regional state, willing to deal with any partner whose interests align, regardless of that partner's history with Washington. Iran's strategy is patience. Wait for American commitments to exceed American capacity. Wait for regional partners to realize that their deference to Washington produces diminishing returns. Then be ready when those partners start looking for alternatives. Egypt looking for alternatives is the strategy working. Now here's what happens next, and I'm putting a clock on these predictions so you can verify them against reality over the next 90 days. Prediction 1. Within 6 weeks, Egypt announces a major infrastructure deal with a Chinese state-owned enterprise. The deal will involve port expansion, renewable energy, or telecommunications. It will be framed as economic development. It will functionally be Egypt signaling that Chinese capital is welcome at a scale that changes Cairo's financial dependence on Western institutions. Watch for the announcement before mid-June. Prediction 2. Within 60 days, Iranian and Egyptian officials hold a publicized meeting, not a secret back-channel discussion. A meeting with cameras, joint statements, and explicit framing around regional stability and economic cooperation. This will be the formalization of what's already happening in private. It forces Washington to react publicly, and public reactions are where you see whether the U.S. has leverage or just legacy influence. Prediction 3. Within 90 days, another Arab state, my assessment says UAE or Oman, announces a bilateral agreement with Iran that goes beyond the Chinese-brokered Saudi-Iran détente. If Egypt moves toward Tehran without consequences, the cost of staying aligned with Washington increases for every other regional actor. Someone else will test the boundaries. The question is who has the most to gain and least to lose. Here's the stakes summary in one sentence. Egypt's 19-hour decision cycle between summit conclusion and Iranian outreach is the sound of American regional architecture cracking under weight it was never designed to carry. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first, the Chinese infrastructure deal, the public Egypt-Iran meeting, or another Arab state formalizing ties with Tehran? Tell me which and why, because I read every single comment, and your assessments over the next 3 months will show whether this analysis holds or needs revision. If this breakdown gave you a framework mainstream coverage didn't, the timeline, the math, the predictions with dates attached, share it with one person who's trying to understand why the Middle East keeps shifting in ways that don't match the official narrative. The next video tracks something even this one didn't reach. A financial mechanism that's being built right now that could end dollar dominance in energy markets within 18 months. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops.